They always saw me as a ghost. Leo Vance, the 41-year-old risk assessor on the 34th floor of the Axiom Financial Tower. To them, I was just scrawny Leo, a walking calculator in a cheap suit. Chad, the head of sales, loved to shoulder-check me, muttering, "Watch it, pencil neck." My world was spreadsheets and quiet condescension. But that Tuesday, the scent of burning plastic replaced stale coffee. The fire alarm shrieked, a sound I'd only ever simulated in risk models. Panic erupted. Chad and his cronies shoved past me towards the elevators, laughing. "Every man for himself, Leo," he yelled back. The elevator doors wouldn't open. Smoke was already seeping under the fire door. And I knew we were trapped. The alarm's strobe light painted our panicked faces in flashes of red. The group was a dozen strong, huddled by the useless elevator bank. Chad, his slick hair now matted with sweat, was at the front. "The stairwell," he barked, yanking on the heavy steel door. "It's the only way down. Stop standing around." Mark, his top salesman and Echo, joined him, pulling uselessly at the handle. But Jessica from marketing was sobbing, pointing a shaking finger at the door's base. "The smoke! It's pouring through the cracks! We'll choke before we make it 10 floors." Her words hit them like a physical blow. The bravado evaporated, replaced by raw fear. They were just reacting, trapped animals looking for an exit. But my mind, the mind they all dismissed, was already working. For 20 years, I hadn't just assessed financial risk, I'd obsessed over this building's blueprints. I knew the ventilation system, the firewall ratings, the load-bearing columns. While they saw a wall of fire and smoke, my mind was running 1,000 simulations. They saw a dead end. I saw a path. I saw my father in Chad's eyes. The same arrogant confidence, the same belief that sheer force could solve any problem, now crumbling into sheer animal terror. For a second, the smoke in the room smelled less like burning carpet and more like gasoline and hot metal. I was 12. My dad was driving us home from a camping trip, his thick arm resting on the open window of his prized pickup truck. He was a contractor, a man who built things with his hands, strong and loud and certain. He was my hero. He was also speeding, laughing as he took a turn too fast on a wet mountain road. "Gotta have a little fun, Leo," he'd said, a moment before the world became a screaming vortex of glass and steel. The truck was wrapped around an oak tree. I came to, pinned by the dashboard, my leg twisted at an angle that wasn't natural. But my father, he was trapped. The man who could lift drywall sheets like cardboard was pinned by the steering column. He pulled, he grunted, he roared with effort, but the crushed metal wouldn't budge. He looked at me, his confidence gone, replaced by the same raw panic I now saw on Chad's face. "It won't move," he whispered, his voice cracking. That was the last thing he ever said. They called the crash an accident. I called it a failure of risk assessment. The rescue team had to use the jaws of life, a tool that exploits structural weaknesses, to get him out. Too late. My own recovery took 2 years. 3 surgeries on my leg. Endless physical therapy that never quite fixed the damage. I was left with a permanent limp and a frame that would never hold the kind of muscle my father had. I was scrawny Leo long before I ever met Chad. But while my body was weak, my mind became a fortress. I devoured books on engineering, on architecture, on emergency protocols. I studied blueprints not as drawings, but as maps of survival. I dedicated my life to seeing the cracks in the system, the single points of failure that confident men like my father and Chad always overlooked. I became a risk assessor because I swore I would never again be a victim of someone else's reckless certainty. I looked at the terrified faces around me. They were trapped by a faulty door and a cloud of smoke. They thought they were facing a wall. But for 30 years I'd been training for this exact moment. They saw a dead end. I saw the blueprint. And I saw the way out. I stepped past them, my limp more pronounced in my haste. The air was getting thick, tasting of chemicals and something horribly organic. I ignored the useless stairwell door and placed my hand on the cool, blank drywall of the west wall. "Here," I said, my voice cutting through the whimpers and shallow breathing. "This is the way out." A dozen terrified eyes stared at me, then at the wall, then back at me. It was Chad who broke the silence with a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Have you finally lost it, Vance? We're on the 34th floor, not in some prison break movie. There's nothing there." "You're wrong," I said, turning to face them, my voice steady. "When they built this tower, they fused it with the old Harrison building next door, but they never integrated the emergency systems. Behind this wall is a service corridor, old but solid. It has its own fire suppression system and a pressurized stairwell that will be completely clear of smoke." Jessica wiped her eyes. How do you know that?" "It's my job to know," I said simply. My eyes found Chad's. "While you were practicing your golf swing in your office, I was studying structural reports, for fun." A flicker of doubt crossed Chad's face, quickly replaced by his usual sneer. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. He saw the flicker of hope I'd ignited in the others. "So what's your genius plan, pencil neck?" He spat. "We gonna knock politely and ask the wall to let us through?" I pointed to the emergency fire extinguisher mounted on a nearby column. It weighs 50 pounds. The wall is just 2 layers of gypsum board on steel studs. Hit it between the studs, and we can punch a hole big enough to crawl through." I walked to the wall and knocked, the sound hollow. "Here, the studs are 16 inches apart. The space between is clear." Before I could move, Chad shoved me aside. "I'll handle this." He ripped the heavy red extinguisher from its mount, grunting with the effort as he hefted it onto his shoulder. "This is a man's job." He swung it like a battering ram, not at the spot I'd indicated, but a few feet to the right, putting all his brute force into the blow. The extinguisher hit with a deafening clang of metal on metal. It barely left a dent. Chad had hit a steel support beam dead on. He stumbled back, his arm vibrating from the impact, his face a mask of fury and embarrassment. "You're wasting time," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "You're going to break your arm before you break that wall. Give it to me." He turned on me, his eyes wild, the alpha whose authority was shattered. "Shut up, Vance. I know what I'm doing." He swung again, a desperate, angry blow that missed the beam and gouged a useless chunk out of the wall. Plaster dust filled the air, mixing with the ever-thickening smoke. "Chad, stop!" Jessica screamed. "He knows what he's talking about!" That was it. The final betrayal in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting the fire anymore, he was fighting me. He dropped the extinguisher, its crash echoing in the terrified silence, and squared up to me, jabbing a thick finger into my chest. "You think you're in charge now? You're nothing. You've always been nothing." He shoved me hard, sending me stumbling back against a desk. "I'm the one who gets us out of here, not some scrawny little nobody." From the far end of the hall, a low groan of tortured metal answered him. A section of the ceiling began to buckle, glowing a dull, angry orange. We were out of time. And the man who was supposed to be the leader had just declared war on our only way out. I pushed myself up, my bad leg screaming a familiar fiery protest. The shove hadn't hurt me as much as it had confirmed everything I already knew about him. Chad was a blunt instrument, and he was hitting a wall he couldn't break. I looked past him, not at his face, contorted with rage, but at the glowing orange patch on the ceiling. It was spreading. "Your ego is going to get us all killed," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. It wasn't an accusation, it was a risk assessment. I didn't wait for a response. I limped past him, my uneven gait a steady rhythm against the rising panic in the room. I knelt and wrapped my hands around the cold metal handle of the fire extinguisher he dropped. It was heavy, an awkward dead weight. My arms, the arms Chad and his friends had mocked for years, strained with the effort. "Give me that," Mark, Chad's second-in-command, said, stepping forward. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Chad for orders, he was looking at me. "You'll never swing it." "I don't have to," I replied, getting a firm grip. "It's not about strength, it's about precision." I rose to my feet, the 50-pound cylinder pulling at my shoulders. I ignored the burning in my muscles and the throbbing in my leg. I was no longer Leo Vance, the ghost of the 34th floor. I was a man who had spent a lifetime studying failure points. Chad was a failure point. Brute force was a failure point. This wall was not. I shuffled to the spot I'd identified earlier, the hollow space between the studs. I didn't swing it like a sledgehammer. I held it tight against my body, took 2 short shuffling steps, and let momentum do the work. I aimed for the center of the bay, putting the force of my entire body weight behind the impact. The sound was not a clang of metal, but a dull, satisfying thud, followed by the crack and splinter of rupturing gypsum. A spiderweb of fractures appeared on the wall's surface. "Again," Jessica breathed, her voice tight with a desperate hope. I stepped back and drove the extinguisher into the same spot. This time, a huge chunk of drywall exploded inward, revealing the dark, dusty space beyond. A wave of cool, clean air washed over my face, smelling of old concrete and nothing else. No smoke. Chad just stared, his mouth hanging open. He hadn't been defeated in a fight. He had simply been rendered irrelevant. A shower of hot sparks rained down from the buckling ceiling panel. A low, guttural roar echoed from the hallway as the fire found a new source of oxygen. "Now," I said, dropping the extinguisher and turning to the others, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard from me before. "We move. Now." For a second, nobody moved. They just stared into the dusty darkness beyond the ragged hole, at the promise of clean air. It was the silence of people witnessing a miracle they couldn't comprehend. The roaring fire behind us filled that silence, a hungry beast chewing through the 34th floor. Jessica broke the spell. "Leo, what do we do?" Her voice was a fragile thread, but her eyes were fixed on me, not on Chad. Everyone's were. "The hole's too small," I stated, my mind already on the next 3 steps. "We have to widen it. Rip the plasterboard out between 2 studs." I looked at Mark. He was built like a linebacker, his expensive suit now torn and smudged with soot. "Mark." That desk Chad shoved me against. "Rip one of the metal legs off, use it as a lever." Mark nodded once, a quick, decisive movement. He didn't even glance at Chad for permission. He grabbed the overturned desk and wrenched at a leg, his muscles straining. The metal groaned in protest before snapping free. Chad finally found his voice, a venomous whisper. "You're all going to listen to him? To Vance?" No one answered. Mark was already at the wall, jamming the jagged end of the desk leg into the opening I'd made. "Where do I pry?" he asked, looking back at me. "Against the stud on the right," I directed, pointing. "The metal frame. Use it for leverage. Don't just pull. Put your body into it." Plaster and drywall dust rained down as Mark heaved. A huge section tore away, exposing the dark cavity. The cool, stale air from within was a tangible relief against our skin. We could see the second layer of drywall now, the back of the corridor wall. A groan of despair went through the group. "There's another one," someone murmured. "I know," I said, my tone cutting off the rising panic. "It's just one layer, thinner. It won't have the same backing." I looked at the hole Mark had made. It was just big enough. "We don't need to break the whole thing. We just need to go through." The ceiling above the main hallway let out a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of metal in half. The orange glow intensified, and the heat washed over us in a searing wave. "Time's up," I said. "Jessica, you first. On your hands and knees. Crawl through the space between the studs, then kick out the wall on the other side. It'll be easy. Don't stop until you're standing in the corridor." Go." She didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor and scrambled into the wall. A moment later, we heard a frantic series of thumps, and then a section of the far wall blew out into the darkness. "I'm through!" she cried out, her voice echoing in the new space. "It's clear! I can't believe it, it's clear!" "Next," I commanded, "one at a time. Help the person in front of you. Keep moving." One by one they crawled through the wall, my colleagues transforming from financial analysts into frantic survivors. Their terrified faces would appear for a moment in the dusty space between worlds, before disappearing into the safety of the corridor. Mark went, then others I barely knew by name. They were a team now, not because of corporate retreats or trust falls, but because of a shared terror and a single, clear voice telling them what to do. Soon, only Chad and I were left. The room was an oven. The fire had breached the far end of the hall and was rolling across the ceiling towards us, a wave of liquid flame. Chad stared at the jagged hole in the wall, the escape route created by the man he despised. He looked at me, his face a mask of sweat and disbelief. The alpha had been dethroned, and he didn't know how to act. He was waiting for an order. From me. "Get in," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Crawl." For a split second, I saw his pride war with his survival instinct. Pride lost. He fell to his knees, the sound of his expensive trousers ripping barely audible over the inferno, and crawled awkwardly into the wall. I watched him go, his broad shoulders barely squeezing between the steel studs. He didn't look back. I was last. I swung my bad leg forward, kneeling on the good one. The pain was a sharp, white-hot spike, but I ignored it. I pulled myself forward, my hands scraping against the rough edges of the broken drywall. The heat on my back was immense, like standing too close to a blast furnace. My cheap suit felt like it was starting to melt. I was halfway through when the main ceiling gave way. A massive section of burning debris and twisted ductwork crashed down right where we had all been standing seconds before. The shockwave slammed into me, throwing me forward through the second hole. I landed hard on the concrete floor of the service corridor, a cloud of century-old dust exploding around me. I rolled over, gasping, my lungs burning not from smoke, but from the sudden intake of clean, cool air. The hole we'd come through was now a window into hell, a roaring vortex of orange and black. My colleagues were huddled together a few feet away, their faces lit by the flickering nightmare next to us. They were safe. We were safe. I pushed myself into a sitting position, my leg throbbing in time with my pulse. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the one piece of non-essential equipment I carried with me every single day. A small, tactical flashlight. I clicked it on. A powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a long, narrow concrete corridor that stretched away from the fire. It was exactly as the blueprints had shown. Chad was leaning against the far wall, breathing heavily. He looked from the flashlight in my hand to my face, his own expression unreadable in the harsh glare. "You knew," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "You knew this was here the whole time." "I assess risk," I replied, getting unsteadily to my feet and leaning against the wall. I swept the flashlight beam down the corridor. "It's what I do." The beam settled on a metal sign, covered in dust, with a single arrow and the word, "Stairs." "And right now," I said, my voice echoing in the concrete tomb, "I assess that the safest path is forward." I started down the narrow concrete steps, my flashlight beam cutting a bouncing, ghostly path into the oppressive darkness. The air was cold, still, and thick with the dust of decades. My colleagues followed without a word, their shuffling footsteps and ragged breaths the only sounds. We were a procession of ghosts escaping a funeral pyre. The descent was steep, the iron railing cold and gritty under my hand. Every few floors, the beam would catch old, faded stenciling on the wall. 32, 31, 30. We moved like a well-oiled machine, a single organism focused on survival. Except for Chad. After 10 floors, his fear began to curdle back into arrogance. He shoved past Mark. "This is taking too long," he growled, his voice too loud in the confined space. "We need to pick up the pace." He started taking the stairs 2 at a time, his heavy dress shoes slapping against the concrete. I stopped, holding up a hand. The entire column of people behind me halted instantly. "Chad, stop," I called out, my voice sharp. "Stay with the group, 1 at a time on the landings. This structure is over 80 years old." He paused on the landing for the 24th floor and spun around, his face illuminated from below by my flashlight, making him look like a cheap Halloween monster. "Oh, here we go. The risk assessor is going to tell me how to walk down a flight of stairs now? I'm getting out of here, Vance. If you want to crawl, fine. But don't you dare give me another order." He turned and stomped across the small square landing towards the next flight of stairs. I saw it before it happened. A subtle spiderweb of cracks in the concrete near the center, a faint reddish-brown corrosion bleeding from the rebar beneath. My blueprints had noted this section for remedial inspection L. It had never been done. "The wall!" I yelled, my voice cracking with urgency. "Stay by the wall!" It was the same tone he'd used on me just minutes before. An order. He flinched, his pride stung. In that fatal, final act of defiance, he deliberately stepped right onto the center of the landing. The sound was not a loud crack, but a sickening, grinding crunch. The concrete disintegrated under his weight. One moment he was a man filled with belligerent purpose. The next he was gone, swallowed by the darkness with a strangled cry. Jessica screamed. I rushed forward, my light finding the jagged, gaping hole where the landing used to be. Below, maybe 10 feet down, Chad was dangling. He'd managed to grab hold of a thick bundle of electrical conduit running along the wall, his legs kicking frantically in the empty air. His face, white with terror and streaked with dust, looked up into my flashlight beam. His bravado, his strength, his entire identity had vanished in a second. He was just a terrified man, hanging over a black abyss, and in his eyes, I saw my father. Pinned by the steering column, the life draining out of him, his powerful hands useless against the crushed metal. The same look of utter helpless panic. "It won't move. Help me," Chad whimpered, his voice a pathetic shred of what it had been. His grip was slipping on the dusty conduit. "Vance, please. I can't hold on." The others stared, paralyzed. They were looking at me, waiting. For what? An order? A verdict? A small, dark part of me, the 12-year-old boy with the shattered leg, whispered that this was justice. This was a risk assessment that had finally paid out. I could just turn, lead the others down, and leave him. A problem solved by gravity and shoddy maintenance. But I wasn't my father, and I wasn't Chad. My entire life had been a reaction against their brand of reckless certainty. Letting him fall would be just another version of the same failure. "Belts!" I snapped, my voice cutting through the shock. "Everyone, take off your belts, now." They fumbled with their buckles, their eyes still locked on the hole. I looked at Mark. "Give me yours first." He handed me his thick leather belt. I looped it through my own, pulled it tight, then reached for the next one. We linked 3 of them together, a makeshift rope of expensive leather. "It won't be strong enough," Mark whispered, his face pale. "It will," I said, testing the buckles. "The tensile strength is more than adequate. It's not about brute force, it's about engineering." I knelt at the edge of the hole, the broken concrete digging into my knees. "Chad, I'm lowering this down. You have to grab it with one hand. One hand. Do you understand?" He nodded, frantically, his knuckles white. I lowered the chain of belts, the final buckle dangling just above his head. He let go with his right hand, snatching at the belt, his body swinging wildly. For a terrifying second, I thought he would lose his grip. His whole body shuddered with the effort of holding on. "Don't pull!" I shouted, my voice a commander's bark. "Mark, brace against the far wall. Anchor us. Everyone else, get a hand on the line, now!" They obeyed, without question. They became a single machine, a human pulley system born from terror and trust. It wasn't about individual strength. It was about distributing the load. The leather groaned, the buckles strained, but they held. Slowly, inch by painful inch, we hauled him up from the abyss. The sound of his $1,000 suit tearing against the jagged rebar was the only sound besides our own ragged breathing. He flopped onto the landing, a boneless, shuddering heap. He curled into a ball, his face buried in his arms, his body racked with pathetic, gasping sobs. The alpha was gone, replaced by a broken child. After a moment he looked up at me, his eyes stripped bare of arrogance, filled only with a bottomless shame. You, he couldn't finish. He couldn't find the words. I didn't offer him a hand. I didn't say a single word of reproach. The satisfaction I felt wasn't pleasure, it was validation, a quiet, cold certainty. For a fleeting second, I saw my father's face in his, trapped and helpless. My whole life had been shaped by a man's fatal overconfidence. I could have let Chad fall, it would have been justice. But my victory wasn't his death. It was their lives. I nudged his shoulder with the toe of my shoe, a gesture not of aggression but of dismissal. 30 seconds to get your breath, I said, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. Then you get up and you get in line, behind Jessica. I turned my back on him before he could respond, sweeping my flashlight beam down into the darkness. The rest of the way we stay single file. Everyone touches the wall. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the final word. Behind me I heard him scramble to his feet, his choked sob the sound of his absolute surrender. We were moving again, a silent column descending into the dark. My father had failed his last risk assessment. I had just passed mine. Tell me about a time someone completely underestimated you, and you gotta prove them wrong.